So for me, I think of reconciliation at different levels. I think of it, in terms of the relationship between Canada and different Indigenous nations and peoples across the country. And I also think of it in terms of institutions where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has asked for change with their 94 calls to action. And then I also think of it in terms of myself and my personal responsibilities. So maybe to start at that more macro level, when I hear the term reconciliation, I can remember a talk that took place in the late 90s up at the University of Alberta at an African Studies Association conference where Wole Soyinka, a Nigerian playwright, talked about the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa. And for him, you cannot have reconciliation without restitution, with some kind of either, return or reparations or an acknowledgement. It has to go beyond an acknowledgement of the harm that's been done. And you have to start talking about change. And I think that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is about. It's a blueprint for change throughout institutions in our society. The other conversation that comes to mind is an article that appeared in Fuse magazine by a Métis artist named David Garneau from the University of Regina. And in talking about decolonization, he said, when I use the term decolonization, I'm not saying, all settlers should leave the country. He talks about a decolonization of the mind. And I think that's very important. And I think it's at the heart of what we need if reconciliation is to truly happen. And because I think, we can talk about the different institutions. We can talk about if we're in those institutions, whether it's a university, a public school, the healthcare system, justice, whatever, we can all play a role for promoting change within those institutions. But for me, at the heart of what's gone on here in Canada historically has been the appropriation of Indigenous lands and oppression of cultures. And land and resources, for me, are at the heart of what needs to really change in terms of reconciliation at the level of Canada and different Indigenous nations. And I think what happened in BC with the Wet'suwet'en is a perfect example of that, where younger activists who were involved in that struggle, young Indigenous activists, basically said for them, given what happened with armed force being brought in, was that reconciliation was dead. And I think what that reveals is like what's at the heart of it. And I think when Garneau talks about decolonizing the mind, he's taught, I think, or what I remember is part of what he's talking about is how do we as white settlers think about the land? What is our relationship to the land? And we need to change our thinking. We need to decolonize our mind, get rid of the attitudes and ideas that we came here with as settlers, around the land being a resource to be exploited, a commodity to be sold and exchanged, and something that you can take away from other people. And we think of it as something we don't seem to really care if we destroy it and or communities still living very close to the land. So for me, that's the big macro level picture. And I think as individuals, it means that we all need to be involved in any kind of land claim struggle that's still happening, any kind of Indigenous-led actions around resource extraction. We need to be there. We need to stand there. We need to be in solidarity. And again, I think those actions and things are led by Indigenous peoples. They know and everyone will have their own interpretation, but Indigenous peoples know what reconciliation means to them. They know what needs to change here in this country, and it's up to us to stand in solidarity. It's not about us going in and somehow, you know, fixing things. And when I bring it down to a personal level, because, you know, I no longer work in an organization, but I do volunteer in different community groups. And one is We're Together Ending Poverty, where the focus is poverty, a lot of work around basic income. And I think what we're learning is that even though, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission doesn't talk in general about us, talks a lot about learning about, you know, Indigenous history, Indigenous rights, about the history of the residential schools, about racism. I think that's so central to this process. So within WTEP, you know, how do we work on these things? And we do use an intersectional analysis around poverty. So I think in looking at poverty, we need to take into account the experiences of Indigenous peoples and learn from Indigenous peoples their understanding of poverty as a result of colonization and what needs to change. And I think it's critical. I was at participated in a conference. There's a young Indigenous woman from Ontario speaking about the environmental movement and how for even herself as a young activist, it took her a while to come to that realization. You cannot talk about the environment in isolation from the peoples who live in that environment and all of the struggles that they face. And that if you're active in the environmental movement, you also have to be active working in solidarity with those concerned with murdered and missing women in Canada, for example. So I think I'll just end with one more thing. And so for myself, it's also involved a lot of reading and learning, participating in book clubs around Indigenous issues, and just continually learning about Indigenous issues, read Indigenous fiction, anti-racism material, etc. Thank you.